Why fear is more effective than violence. A woman pulls into a grocery store parking lot. She sees an open space near the entrance. As she starts to turn in, a man in a truck revs his engine and inches forward. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't honk. He just moves his truck into a position where she would have to squeeze past him to take the spot. She stops. She backs up. She takes a different spot farther away. He parks, he gets out, he walks into the store. Nothing was said, no contact was made. But something happened. She changed her behavior. She gave up something she wanted. And he got what he wanted without ever touching her, or even speaking to her. Now imagine a different version. The man jumps out of his truck. He yells. He slams his door. He walks toward her car with his fists clenched. She calls the police. Other people turn to look. Someone films it on their phone. He might get arrested. He might get banned from the store. His face might end up online. In the first version, he won easily. In the second version, he created a scene that could cost him far more than a parking spot. This is the difference between violence and fear. Violence is loud. It draws attention. It creates evidence. It forces a reaction. Fear is quiet. It happens in the space before anything physical occurs. It changes behavior without leaving a mark. And that is why fear is more effective than violence. What fear does that violence cannot? Violence is the use of physical force to harm or control another person. It is visible. It is measurable. It leaves evidence. Fear is the anticipation of harm. It is the feeling that something bad might happen. It does not require harm to occur. It only requires the possibility of harm. Violence has limits. You can only hurt someone so much before they stop functioning. You can only threaten someone so many times before the threat loses meaning. You can only escalate so far before you create consequences for yourself. Fear has no such limits. It exists in the imagination. It grows in the space between what has happened and what could happen. It does not need to be refreshed with new acts of violence. Once it is established, it sustains itself. A person who uses violence must keep using it. Each time they risk more. Each time they create more evidence. Each time they give the other person more reason to escape, resist, or seek help. A person who uses fear can stop acting and let the fear continue working. The other person does the rest. They imagine what might happen. They remember what happened before. They adjust their behavior to avoid triggering the thing they are afraid of. They monitor themselves. They correct themselves. The person who created the fear does not have to do anything at all. This is why abusers do not hit their partners every day. They do not need to. One violent act, followed by silence, can control behavior for weeks. The victim does not know when the next incident will occur. They only know it could occur. So they become careful. They watch for signs. They try to avoid doing the wrong thing. They manage their own behavior in response to a threat that is not even active. This is why a boss does not need to fire someone every week to maintain control. They fire one person in a visible way. Everyone else sees it. Everyone else starts to wonder if they could be next. They begin to monitor their own behavior. They stop asking questions. They stop pushing back. The firing does not need to be repeated. The fear of being next is enough. Violence requires constant action. Fear requires only the memory of action and the belief that it could happen again. How fear is installed. Fear does not appear by itself. It is built. It is installed through a sequence of events that teaches a person what to be afraid of and what happens when they ignore that fear. The first step is a demonstration. Something happens that shows the person what the other person is capable of. This does not have to be dramatic. It can be small. A raised voice, a slammed door, a sharp email sent late at night, a sudden withdrawal of warmth. The key is that it is unexpected. It breaks the normal pattern. It shows that the other person can change the atmosphere quickly. The second step is unpredictability. The person does not know when the demonstration will happen again. There is no clear rule. Sometimes the same behavior that was fine yesterday results in anger today. Sometimes the person is calm, sometimes they are not. The target cannot predict when things will go wrong, so they begin to assume things could go wrong at any time. The third step is isolation. The person is cut off from feedback that would tell them the behavior is not normal. Maybe they are told no one else would understand. Maybe they are told they are too sensitive. Maybe they are kept away from other people who might point out what is happening. Without outside perspective, the person begins to accept the framework they are being given. The fourth step is normalization. Time passes. The person adjusts. The thing that seemed shocking at first becomes part of the background. They stop thinking of it as wrong. They start thinking of it as just how things are. They build their life around it. They learn what triggers it. They learn how to avoid it. The fear becomes part of how they operate. Once these steps are complete, the fear is installed. The person now manages their own behavior. They do not need to be told what to do. They already know. They have learned the rules through experience. They have learned that breaking the rules leads to something bad. So they follow the rules. And the person who installed the fear does not have to do much of anything. The efficiency of anticipated consequences. A manager does not respond to an employee's email for 3 days. When they finally respond, the message is short. It does not acknowledge the employee's questions. It simply says, "Let's discuss this in person." The employee spends those 3 days wondering what they did wrong. They replay the email in their mind. They try to figure out what upset the manager. They imagine how the conversation will go. They prepare explanations, they rehearse apologies. By the time the meeting happens, the employee is already off balance. The manager has not said anything critical yet. But the employee is already in a defensive posture. The silence did the work. The delay did the work. The employee's imagination did the rest. This is the efficiency of fear. The person doing the imagining does most of the labor. The person in power simply has to create the conditions under which that imagining occurs. A parent does not need to yell at their child every time the child misbehaves. They yell once in a way that frightens the child. After that, all they need to do is use a certain tone of voice. The child hears that tone and remembers the yelling. They stop what they are doing. The parent did not have to yell again. The memory of yelling was enough. A partner does not need to have an outburst every time they are displeased. They have an outburst once. After that, the other person becomes alert to signs that another outburst might be coming. They notice when their partner gets quiet. They notice when their partner's tone changes. They adjust their behavior before anything happens. The outburst does not need to occur again. The possibility of it occurring is enough. This is why fear is efficient. It turns the target into their own regulator. They monitor themselves. They correct themselves. They imagine consequences and then act to avoid those consequences. The person in power does not have to watch them. The target is already watching themselves. The silence between actions. A teacher publicly criticizes a student's work in front of the class. The student is humiliated. The teacher does not do this again for weeks. But the student does not forget. Every time they raise their hand, they hesitate. Every time they turn in an assignment, they feel a small tightness in their chest. They are waiting for it to happen again. The teacher does not need to repeat the criticism. The student is already living in response to it. The silence between the first incident and the imagined second incident is where the fear does its work. This is a key feature of how fear operates. It does not require constant reinforcement. Once fear is established, silence becomes a tool. The absence of action is not the same as safety. It is the space in which the target wonders when the next action will occur. A coworker snaps at someone during a meeting. Everyone in the room goes quiet. The coworker does not apologize. They do not acknowledge it. They simply continue with the meeting as if nothing happened. The next day they are friendly. They act normal. But the other people in the meeting do not forget. They are careful around this coworker now. They do not know what will set them off. They do not know if the friendliness is real or temporary. So they are cautious. They keep things light. They avoid certain topics. The coworker did not have to snap at anyone again. The one incident was enough to change how everyone interacts with them. Silence is not the absence of control. It is a form of control. It keeps the target in a state of uncertainty. They do not know what is coming. They only know that something could come. So they prepare, they adjust, they manage their own behavior in advance. How people mistake fear for respect. A team leader runs a tight ship. People do what she says. They do not push back. They do not ask unnecessary questions. They complete tasks quickly. When she walks into a room, people sit up a little straighter. When she sends an email, people respond right away. To an outsider, this looks like respect. It looks like a well-run team. It looks like effective leadership. But the people on the team do not feel respect. They feel caution. They are not responding quickly because they admire her. They are responding quickly because they have learned that delays lead to sharp questions. They do not push back because they trust her judgment. They do not push back because the last person who pushed back was dressed down in front of everyone. The behavior looks the same from the outside, but the feeling is completely different. This is one of the most common mistakes people make when observing power. They see compliance and assume it is willing. They see efficiency and assume it is motivated by alignment. They do not see the fear that is producing the behavior. A father believes his children respect him because they obey him without argument. But his children are quiet around him because they have learned that arguing leads to anger. They are not silent out of respect. They are silent out of avoidance. A boss believes their team is loyal because no one ever quits. But the team does not stay because they love the job. They stay because they have been told repeatedly that no one else will hire them. They stay because they are afraid of what will happen if they leave. The person in power often cannot tell the difference between fear and respect. The behavior looks identical. Both produce compliance. Both produce efficiency. Both produce quiet. But respect is given freely. Fear is extracted. Respect survives the removal of power. Fear disappears the moment the power is gone. A teacher who is respected is remembered fondly by students years later. A teacher who was feared is remembered differently. Students describe them in careful language. They say things like, "You did not want to cross her," or "He kept the class under control." The language is neutral. The feeling behind it is not. Fear produces a kind of efficiency that looks like respect from a distance. But it is brittle. It does not bend. It does not survive challenge. The moment the person in power is not present, the compliance evaporates. People relax. They speak differently. They act differently. The behavior was never about respect. It was about managing a threat. What fear does to interpretation. Manager sends a message. "Can we talk later?" If the relationship is built on trust, the employee thinks they probably have a question, or maybe there's a new project. If the relationship is built on fear, the employee thinks, "What did I do wrong?" The words are identical, but the meaning changes completely depending on the foundation beneath them. This is what fear does to interpretation. It warps the meaning of neutral communication. It makes ordinary interactions feel loaded. It turns questions into accusations. It turns delays into warnings. A partner says, "We need to talk." In a healthy relationship, this is a request to discuss something. In a relationship built on fear, this phrase triggers immediate anxiety. The person hearing it begins to prepare for conflict. They begin to defend themselves against criticism that has not been stated yet. The words have not changed, but the fear has changed what the words mean. A parent says to a child, "Come here." In a calm household, this is a simple instruction. In a household where punishment is unpredictable, the child's heart rate increases. They try to remember what they might have done wrong. They walk slowly. They watch the parent's face for clues. The instruction is the same. The experience is completely different. Fear makes people interpret communication defensively. They are not listening for information. They are listening for danger. They are scanning for signs of displeasure. They are trying to assess whether they are in trouble. This creates a distortion. The person in power may say something neutral. They may even say something positive. But the person who is afraid hears it differently. They look for the hidden meaning. They wonder if it is a test. They do not take the words at face value because they have learned that the surface meaning is not always the real meaning. A boss says, "Good work on that report." An employee who trusts the boss hears praise. An employee who fears the boss wonders what is coming next. They think, "Are they softening me up before delivering bad news? Or, what do they want from me now?" The praise is the same, but fear has taught the employee that positive words are sometimes followed by negative consequences. So they do not relax. They stay alert. This is the interpretive trap that fear creates. It makes it impossible to receive communication clearly. Everything is filtered through the question, "Is this safe or is this a warning?" How small gestures become signals. In a home where anger is unpredictable, people learn to read small signs. A door closes a little harder than usual. A person walks a little faster. A response is a little shorter. These are not dramatic gestures, but they become signals. The person who is afraid begins to track these signals. They notice when the other person is tense. They notice when the atmosphere shifts. They do not wait for anger to be expressed. They respond to the early signs of it. They adjust their behavior in advance. A child hears their parents' car pull into the driveway. They listen to how the car door closes. They listen to how the front door opens. If the sounds are sharp, they know to be quiet. If the sounds are normal, they relax a little. They have learned to read their environment at a level of detail that most people never develop. This kind of vigilance is exhausting, but it is also necessary in an environment where the consequences of missing a signal can be severe. A partner learns that when their spouse uses a certain phrase, an argument is coming. The phrase itself is not hostile. It might be something like, "I've been thinking." But the person who has lived with this spouse long enough knows that this phrase is often followed by complaints or accusations. So when they hear it, they tense up. They prepare themselves. They stop what they are doing and give their full attention. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition. The person has learned through experience that certain small gestures predict larger events, so they respond to the gestures. They do not wait for the event. The person creating the fear may not even be aware that these signals exist. They are not necessarily doing it on purpose. But the effect is the same. The other person is monitoring them constantly. They are reading tone, timing, posture, and word choice at a level that most interactions do not require. This is one of the hidden costs of fear. It turns ordinary interaction into a constant assessment of danger. The person who is afraid is never fully relaxed. They are always partially focused on monitoring the other person's mood and adjusting their own behavior accordingly. How fear grows in groups. A team of 8 people works under a manager who is unpredictable. Sometimes he is friendly. Sometimes he is cold. Sometimes he criticizes work harshly in front of everyone. Sometimes he says nothing at all. One person on the team suggests a new approach to a project. The manager dismisses it immediately. He does not explain why. He simply says, "That won't work," and moves on. The person who made the suggestion feels embarrassed. They do not suggest anything again. The other 7 people on the team saw what happened. They do not say anything, but they make a note. They learn that suggestions are risky. They see that the manager does not like being questioned. So they stop suggesting things. No one told them to stop. But they all made the same calculation. They all decided it was safer to stay quiet. This is how fear spreads in groups. It does not require everyone to experience the consequence directly. It only requires everyone to witness the consequence. A teacher yells at one student. The other students do not get yelled at, but they all become more careful. They all adjust their behavior. The single incident affects the entire room. A boss fires one employee in a visible, dramatic way. The other employees do not get fired, but they all start wondering if they could be next. They all become more cautious. They all work a little harder. They all complain a little less. The fear is distributed across the group, even though only one person experienced the direct consequence. This is the multiplying effect of fear. One action affects many people. Each person who witnesses the action imagines how it would feel to be on the receiving end. They do not want to find out, so they adjust. The person in power does not have to discipline everyone. They only have to discipline one person in a way that everyone else can see. The rest of the group will regulate themselves. This is why public criticism is so effective. It is not just about correcting the person being criticized. It is about sending a message to everyone else. The message is, this could happen to you. The people watching do not need to be told that explicitly. They understand it. They make the connection on their own. And they adjust accordingly. The difference between authority and fear. A police officer directs traffic at an intersection. Drivers stop when the officer holds up a hand. They go when the officer waves them forward. They do this because the officer has authority. The authority comes from the role. It is recognized by society. It does not depend on the individual officer being frightening. A different officer pulls a driver over. The officer approaches the window. The driver's hands are shaking. The driver is polite to the point of being submissive. The driver agrees to things they do not have to agree to. They answer questions they do not have to answer. This is not authority. This is fear. Authority is the right to make decisions or give orders based on a recognized role or position. Fear is the emotional response to a perceived threat. Authority can exist without fear. A judge has authority in a courtroom. People follow the rules of the court not because they are afraid of the judge as a person, but because they recognize the role the judge holds. If the judge is calm, fair, and consistent, people may respect the authority without feeling fear. But authority can also be enforced through fear. When a person in a position of authority uses that position to threaten, intimidate, or punish unpredictably, the authority becomes inseparable from fear. People comply not because they recognize the legitimacy of the role, but because they are afraid of what will happen if they do not. A parent has authority over a child. The parent makes decisions about bedtime, meals, and safety. The child follows these rules. In a healthy dynamic, the child follows the rules because they trust that the parent is acting in their interest. The child may not always like the rules, but they accept them. In a different home, a child follows the rules because they are afraid of being hit. They do what they are told not because they trust the parent's judgment, but because they want to avoid pain. The parent still has authority. But the compliance is not based on trust. It is based on fear. The outcome looks the same. In both cases, the child obeys, but the mechanism is different. And the long-term effects are different. When authority is based on legitimacy and trust, it teaches the child how to navigate rules and make decisions. When authority is based on fear, it teaches the child how to avoid punishment. The child learns to monitor threats, not to think critically. This distinction matters because fear and authority are often confused. A person in power may believe they are respected because people do what they say. But if people are only complying out of fear, the respect is not real. It is a performance designed to avoid consequences. True authority does not need fear to function. It can rely on clarity, consistency, and fairness. Fear is what fills the gap when those things are absent. How fear removes feedback. A CEO gives a presentation to the company. At the end, she asks, "Does anyone have questions?" The room is silent. She takes this as a sign that the presentation was clear. She moves on. But the silence does not mean the presentation was clear. It means the employees have learned that asking questions can be interpreted as a challenge. It means they have seen what happens to people who speak up in meetings. It means they have decided it is safer to figure things out on their own later than to ask in front of everyone. The CEO does not get feedback. She does not know that people are confused. She does not know that her message was unclear. She only knows that no one asked questions. She interprets the silence as understanding. This is one of the most damaging effects of fear. It removes feedback. People stop telling the person in power when something is wrong. They stop pointing out problems. They stop asking for clarification. They go quiet, and the person in power mistakes that quiet for agreement. A manager implements a new process. The process does not make sense. It creates extra work. It slows things down. But no one says anything. The manager believes the process is working because no one complains. In reality, people are complaining to each other. They are just not complaining to the manager. They have learned that complaints are not welcome. The manager moves forward with the process. Problems pile up. By the time the manager realizes something is wrong, weeks have passed. The damage is done, and the manager wonders why no one said anything earlier. The answer is fear. People did not feel safe saying something. They did not believe their feedback would be received well. So they stayed quiet. And the person who needed the feedback the most was the last to know. This creates a dangerous loop. The person in power makes decisions based on incomplete information. Those decisions create problems. But no one tells them about the problems. So they keep making decisions the same way. The problems get worse. And the gap between what the person in power believes is happening and what is actually happening grows wider. In a healthy environment, feedback flows easily. People feel safe pointing out issues. They feel safe asking questions. They feel safe saying, "This is not working." In an environment built on fear, feedback stops. People only tell the person in power what they think the person wants to hear. They hide problems. They work around bad decisions instead of challenging them. And the person in power becomes isolated from reality. This is why leaders who rule through fear often make catastrophic mistakes. They are surrounded by people who are too afraid to tell them the truth. They only hear good news. They only hear agreement. So they do not course correct until it is too late. How fear changes what people say. A woman is in a meeting with her boss. The boss proposes an idea that will not work. The woman knows it will not work. She has seen this approach fail before. She has data that shows why it will fail. But she does not say anything. She nods. She takes notes. She acts as if the idea makes sense. Later, a coworker asks her what she thought of the idea. She says, "It's not going to work." The coworker says, "Why didn't you say that in the meeting?" She says, "You know how he gets." This is how fear changes what people say. It creates two conversations. There is the conversation that happens in front of the person in power. And there's the conversation that happens when that person is not in the room. In the first conversation, people agree. They nod. They say things like, "That makes sense," or "I'll look into that." They do not challenge. They do not question. They give the appearance of alignment. In the second conversation, people say what they actually think. They point out problems. They express doubts. They share concerns. But none of this reaches the person who needs to hear it. This creates a gap between what the person in power believes and what everyone else knows. The person in power thinks there is agreement. Everyone else knows there is not. But no one bridges that gap because doing so feels too risky. A team meets with the senior executive. The executive asks how a project is going. The project is behind schedule. There are major problems. But the team leader says, "We're on track." The executive says, "Great. Keep me posted." After the meeting, the team leader turns to the team and says, We need to fix this fast. The team members look at each other. They know the project is not on track. They know the team leader just lied, but they also know why. They know that telling the executive the truth would have led to anger, blame, or consequences. So they say nothing. This is the distortion that fear creates. It makes honest communication dangerous. It rewards people for hiding problems and pretending things are fine. And it punishes people for being direct. Over time, the gap between what is said and what is true becomes normal. People stop expecting honesty in certain contexts. They learn to read between the lines. They learn to interpret what is not being said. But this makes organizations, relationships, and groups dysfunctional. Decisions are made based on false information. Problems are hidden until they become crises. And the person in power remains unaware of how much they are not being told. How fear becomes invisible. A couple has been together for 10 years. Early in the relationship, one partner would become angry when the other spent time with friends. There were arguments. There were accusations. There was yelling. Now there are no arguments. The partner who used to spend time with friends simply does not do that anymore. They do not make plans. They do not accept invitations. When someone asks them to go out, they say, "I can't," or "maybe another time." Their friends stop asking. They assume the person is busy or not interested. But the person is not busy. They are managing a dynamic that has become invisible. They are avoiding a conflict that no longer needs to be stated. The anger does not happen anymore because the behavior that triggered it has stopped. From the outside, the relationship looks calm. There is no fighting. There is no drama. It looks stable. But the calm is not the result of mutual understanding. It is the result of one person shaping their life around the other person's unstated rules. The fear is still there. It is just no longer visible. This is how fear becomes invisible over time. The initial incidents that created the fear fade into the past. The person who is afraid adjusts their behavior. The other person stops having to enforce the boundary because the boundary is no longer being tested. To an outsider, the dynamic looks normal. But to the person living inside it, the fear is still active. It is just quiet. It is built into the structure of daily life. A worker has been at the same company for 8 years. They used to ask for raises. They used to push back on unreasonable requests. They used to advocate for themselves. Now, they do not do any of that. They say yes to everything. They work late without being asked. They do not negotiate. A new coworker notices this and asks, "Why don't you push back? You've been here longer than anyone." The worker says, "It's just not worth it." The new coworker does not understand. They think the worker is passive. They think the worker does not care. But the worker does care. They have simply learned that pushing back leads to consequences that are not worth the risk. They have learned to shape their behavior in ways that avoid those consequences. The fear is still operating. It is just no longer producing visible conflict. This is the final stage of fear. It becomes part of how a person moves through the world. It is no longer a response to an immediate threat. It is a baseline state. The person is not constantly thinking, "I am afraid." They are simply living in a way that reflects the fear they learned years ago. And because the fear is invisible, other people misread the behavior. They see compliance and think it is agreement. They see quiet and think it is contentment. They do not see the history that produced the behavior. They only see the behavior itself. When the threat is gone, but the fear remains. A man grows up in a house where his father is violent. The violence is unpredictable. Sometimes it is triggered by small things. Sometimes it happens for no clear reason. The man learns to be quiet. He learns to make himself small. He learns to read his father's mood and adjust his behavior accordingly. As an adult, the man no longer lives with his father. He is in his own home. He is safe. There is no violence. But he still flinches when someone raises their voice. He still tenses up when someone moves quickly near him. He still apologizes for things that do not require an apology. He still monitors the mood of the people around him and adjusts his behavior to keep things calm. The threat is gone, but the fear remains. This is one of the lasting effects of fear. It does not always disappear when the situation that created it ends. The patterns of thought and behavior that were necessary for survival in one context continue in a new context where they are no longer necessary. A woman works for a boss who criticizes her constantly. Every small mistake is treated as a major failure. She becomes hypervigilant. She checks her work over and over. She stays late to make sure everything is perfect. She is anxious all the time. Eventually, she leaves that job. She finds a new job with a kind, supportive boss. The new boss gives clear feedback. The new boss does not yell. The new boss does not criticize harshly. But the woman is still anxious. She still checks her work obsessively. She still expects criticism, even when none is coming. She still feels like she is on the verge of being in trouble. Her coworkers think she is a perfectionist. They think she is hard on herself. They do not know that her behavior was shaped by a previous environment. They only see how she acts now. The fear does not turn off just because the threat is removed. The fear has become a reflex. It is automatic. It is a way of moving through the world that was learned through experience and reinforced over time. This is why fear is so effective. It does not just control behavior in the moment. It changes how a person thinks and feels long after the situation that created it has ended. It becomes part of who they are. The illusion of strength. A man believes that being feared makes him strong. He believes that if people are afraid of him, they will not challenge him. They will not question him. They will do what he says. And he is right. People do what he says. They are careful around him. They do not challenge him. But he does not see what he has lost. He does not see that people hide information from him. He does not see that they do not trust him. He does not see that they are only compliant because they feel they have no choice. He mistakes compliance for loyalty. He mistakes silence for agreement. He mistakes fear for respect. He believes he is strong because people do what he says. But his strength is brittle. It depends entirely on his ability to maintain the threat. The moment he loses the ability to enforce consequences, the compliance disappears. This is the illusion of strength that fear creates. It looks like power. It produces results. But it is not stable. It is not sustainable. And it does not build anything lasting. A leader who is truly strong does not need fear. They can be challenged and still maintain authority. They can hear criticism and still command respect. Their strength comes from competence, consistency, and integrity, not from the ability to intimidate. A leader who relies on fear is not strong. They are insecure. They need control because they do not trust that people would follow them otherwise. They need fear because they have nothing else to offer. But they do not see it that way. They see people obeying them and believe it is evidence of their power. They do not realize that the obedience is hollow, that it is a performance, that it would evaporate if the threat were removed. Fear gives the person using it a sense of control, but it is a false sense. They are not in control. They are simply creating conditions where other people feel they have no choice. And the moment those people find a choice, they take it. Why violence eventually fails. A regime rules through violence. It imprisons dissidents. It crushes protests. It uses force to maintain order. For a time this works. People are afraid. They do not speak out. They do not organize. They comply. But violence is expensive. It requires constant resources. It requires surveillance. It requires enforcement. It requires people willing to carry out the violence. And each act of violence creates resentment. It creates martyrs. It creates a memory of injustice. Over time, the cost of maintaining control through violence becomes too high. The regime weakens. And when it weakens, the fear that held people in place begins to crack. People start to believe that the regime cannot punish everyone. They start to believe that if enough people resist at once, the regime will not be able to stop them. And they are often right. This is why violence eventually fails as a tool of control. It cannot scale. It cannot be maintained indefinitely. It creates opposition even as it suppresses it. Fear, on the other hand, is cheap. It does not require constant action. It does not require resources. It only requires the belief that consequences exist. And that belief can be maintained with very little effort once it is established. A person who uses fear does not need to act constantly. They only need to act occasionally, in ways that remind people of what they are capable of. The rest of the time, the fear does the work for them. This is why authoritarian systems rely more on fear than on violence. They use violence selectively to create fear in a broader population. They do not need to arrest everyone. They only need to arrest a few people in visible ways. The rest of the population will regulate themselves. But even this has limits. Eventually, people become numb to fear. They become willing to take risks. They decide that the cost of compliance is higher than the cost of resistance. And when that happens, the system collapses. This is the paradox of fear. It is more effective than violence, but it is not permanent. It can be broken. It can be overcome. It requires the cooperation of the people who are afraid. And if those people stop cooperating, the fear loses its power. What breaks the pattern? A woman has worked for the same boss for 5 years. She has adjusted her behavior in countless small ways to avoid conflict. She has learned not to ask certain questions. She has learned not to push back. She has learned to accept criticism without defending herself. One day, she interviews for a job at a different company. The interviewer asks her about her current role. She describes it. The interviewer looks surprised. They ask, "Why do you stay?" It is a simple question, but it makes her stop. She has never asked herself that question. She has been so focused on managing the dynamic with her boss that she has not considered whether the dynamic is worth managing. She gets the new job. She leaves, and in the new environment, she realizes how much of her energy was going toward managing fear. She realizes how much smaller she had made herself. This is what often breaks the pattern. Distance, a change in circumstance. a moment when the person who is afraid realizes they have options. Fear works as long as the person believes they have no choice. The moment they see a choice, the fear loses some of its power. It does not disappear immediately, but it cracks, and through that crack, new possibilities emerge. A child grows up in a household where anger is unpredictable. They learn to manage their parents' moods. They become skilled at reading emotional signals. They shape their behavior around avoiding conflict. Then they go to college. They live in a dorm. They are around people who do not yell. They are around people who communicate clearly. They start to notice that other people do not live the way they lived. They start to see that the dynamic they thought was normal is not normal. This does not fix everything immediately. The patterns are still there. The reflexes are still there. But awareness is the first step. Once a person can see the pattern, they can begin to question it. And once they question it, they can begin to change it. Closing reflection. Fear is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is not what people imagine when they think about control. It is a parking spot given up without a word. It is an email that goes unanswered for 3 days. It is a suggestion that is never made because the last suggestion was dismissed. It is a question that is not asked because asking feels too risky. It is the silence in a meeting, the careful tone in a message, the decision to stay quiet when something does not make sense, the choice to go along even when you disagree. Fear is efficient because it makes people regulate themselves. It is effective because it operates in the space between what has happened and what might happen. It does not need to be refreshed. It does not need to be repeated. Once it is installed, it runs in the background. And because it is quiet, people do not always recognize it. They see compliance and assume it is agreement. They see calm and assume it is contentment. They do not see the effort it takes to maintain that calm. They do not see the calculations happening beneath the surface. You have been in a room where fear was present. You have adjusted your behavior in response to it, even if you did not name it as fear. You have monitored someone's tone. You have waited to see if it was safe to speak. You have decided it was easier to stay quiet. You have also been on the other side. You have seen someone adjust their behavior around you. You have noticed when someone became careful in your presence. You may not have intended to create that dynamic, but the effect was the same. Fear does not require intention. It only requires imbalance. It only requires the belief that one person can affect the other in ways that the other cannot affect them. And once that belief exists, the fear takes care of the rest.